Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. That's a little more robust. Welcome to Aligning Innovations to Promote Learning and Quality Credentials, Competency-Based Education and Credit for Prior Learning. I want to thank everyone for joining ACE's Center for Policy Research and Strategy and Center for Education, Attainment, Innovation, along with our partner, Blackboard, today for the release of the release and discussion of two new papers. The first paper, Credit for Prior Learning, Charting Institutional Practice for Sustainability, and the Currency of Higher Education Credits and Competencies. Two papers which, each in their own way, explore the intersection of ideas and practice that are so important to true innovation as we begin as a community to explore new ways to honor and validate learning in higher education. The Credit for Prior Learning paper provides a deep dive into institutional systems, culture, and practice surrounding this key capability in validating learning, while the Currency of Higher Education paper provides a guide for multiple stakeholders to better understand the emergence of new ways to validate learning. The intersection of ideas and practice is much on ACE's mind these days. The Center for Policy Research and Strategy, with its focus on the intersection of public policy and institutional strategy, and the Center for Education, Attainment, and Innovation, led by my colleague, Deb Seymour, with a focus on how new ideas are developed and developed into sustained practice, are relatively new additions to ACE's portfolio of work. Both were formed through the vision of our president, Molly Broad, one of whose guiding phrases that I always take to heart is, ACE is expert at preserving the best of past practices of American higher education. At a time of great change, we need to develop our skills at promoting its future. It is with an eye on the future that we hold our discussion today. For those of you that are familiar with my own policy writing, you know that I am a student of the innovation literature, in particular of how innovation actually impacts productivity in a given sector of the economy. Recently, I have been drawn to the ongoing work of MIT's Production in the Innovation Economy initiative, as well as the academic writing of New York Times bestselling authors Andrew McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson, who are much in the news because of their highly accessible book, The Second Machine Age. And MIT's Production in the Innovation Economy initiative focuses on the critical feedback loops that exist between new ideas and what you learn by actually putting them into production. And though the initiative focuses on manufacturing, its emphasis on how incremental change and lessons learned from production impact future innovation is highly illustrative of process innovation such as competency-based education and credit for prior learning, and how those particular process innovations are critical to promoting the capability of innovation itself in higher education. They are, in effect, flexing pedagogical muscles that make innovation possible in higher education. I saw this flexing in real time a few years ago with one of our panelists today, Sally Johnstone. I did a consulting project with 8 community colleges. In my job on that consulting project, the community colleges had received tax grants and Gates grants to develop competency-based credentials. And my particular job on that grant project, on that consulting project, was to generate the narrative of the work being done by those colleges. And I sat for long sessions with VPs of instructions, deans, faculty members, and watched them struggle through what it was to define a competency, what it was to actually think about their very pedagogical model. And I saw them over the time on that grant develop that muscle, literally by going through that step-by-step incremental process, increase their innovative capability while they were doing that particular project. And it remains one of the more humbling of my work experiences, sitting with those folks. The policy researcher, you often have either the benefit or the cost of being distant from the work that's actually being done that you advocate for. And it was an amazing learning experience for me to do that. And in fact, if that that story is cataloged in a piece that Sally and I did for Change Magazine last fall, if folks are interested in learning more about it. The second machine age really takes the idea of innovation in its incremental nature to a new level. Essentially, what McAfee and Williamson do is they take the theory of a general purpose technology and how it actually impacts innovation in a sector and bring it into the information age and the next wave of digital technologies. And essentially, their argument is, and has been on the part of many economists, that a general purpose technology actually impacts a sector or increases its productivity at least 50 years after the initial introduction of the technology. By way of an example, they use electricity, which at the time that electricity was introduced to manufacturing in the early 20th century, steam engines were driving factory floors. And for those of you who aren't familiar with steam engines, to power a factory, all the machines need to be along a central axle. And so factory floors were all designed in a linear fashion. And after electricity was used, it wasn't until 50 years later, that the late 1940s, that you started seeing a change in the way factory floors were laid out to take use of the efficiencies that electric motors could be placed on individual machines. And they went to scale with different productivity because of the way they were able to organize the machines. I would argue that competency-based education and credit for prior learning as process innovations are actually rebuilding a new general purpose technology for higher education. And we're in the early stages of accomplishing this. Interestingly enough, when I read the recent Carnegie report, one of the things that I found fascinating was that, in fact, the Carnegie Unit and the Credit Hour were one of the complementary innovations to what I would call the general purpose technology of traditional higher ed, which is the campus. You think of campus as a technology. It aggregated faculty, books in the beginning, and students. It was an efficient way to do that. And I think the Carnegie Unit was one of the complementary innovations to that general purpose technology. And we're now building the new one. And I hope that our contribution, I'm excited to discuss the papers with all of you today. And I hope that we make a contribution to that evolution today. Just to orient us a little bit to the time we'll spend together so that the audience knows what to expect, we will have the two papers presented. Two authors for each paper will spend a little bit of time talking about the papers and their findings. And then we'll have a short time, about 10 minutes, for any clarifying questions. And when I think of clarifying questions, I think of factual questions. Is there something you didn't understand about what the author said, as opposed to the bigger issues that we'll unpack with the panel. And then we'll go into a panel discussion up here on the stage for about 40 minutes, and then go into audience Q&A. Our hashtag, we encourage and actively launch tweeting. Our hashtag is AltPathways, ALTPATHWAYS. Our facilities are out the door to the right by the elevator. And with that, I will bring up our first authors, who are colleagues of mine at ACE. Yay! Chris Nellam, a senior policy analyst with my center, the Center for Policy Research and Strategy, and Mary Beth Lakin, the director of college and university partnerships at our peer sister center, the Center for Education, Attainment, and Innovation.
Good morning. Before I say any more about the paper, I first want to thank two of the authors who are not presenting today. Deb Seymour, who's also an author on the CDE paper, and then Jennifer Crandall, who also works in the Center for Policy Research and Strategy. So as Louis said, we're excited to present this paper today, the first paper entitled Credit for Prior Learning, Charting Institutional Practice for Sustainability. So I'll do two things this morning. One, I'll give you a sense for why we think it's important, why we thought it was important to engage in this work and conduct this research, and then tell you in brief what we did to engage the institutions and actually conduct the research. So why did we do this work? For us, as Louis mentioned just a second ago, post-traditional students and our commitment to those students is something that is woven throughout our work in both centers. And as a result, we're interested in trying to help our member institutions and constituents understand how they can change practice to better serve these students. And so that might involve helping them understand how they can reimagine the academic model, how they can reimagine the business model, all things that are both involved in CPL and CBE. And then on the other hand, we're also very interested, given all of your attendance here today, there's broad interest in prior learning initiatives, and some of those have been demonstrated at the state level. So for example, Colorado just announced their statewide policy on PLA. There's the New Jersey Prior Learning Network. Philadelphia's community colleges have recently realigned and their thinking around prior learning requirements and assessment. And then even at the federal level, the Department of Education is interested in how, through their experimental sites, how institutions can rethink financial aid for students preparing prior learning materials. And so we're very excited about these initiatives. We think they're certainly focused on the right types of students, post-traditional students. However, one of the things that we saw was missing in these often broad, sweeping policy statements is insight for administrators on how to implement and sustain these programs on college campuses. And so those are the questions that we actually sought to understand. We were interested in policy and practice, and we actually, in developing our questions for this research, reflected on ACE's long-standing commitment around credit evaluations. We also have some prior research, focus groups, and surveys, and actually our members were asking us the very questions that we asked for this study. And so to fill that void, we asked three specific questions. The first was, what institutional infrastructures or departments and those sort of things help institutions implement and sustain innovative CPL practice? The second question was centered on students and how they identify students who might benefit from CPL, how they share information with them, and how they ultimately support them in reaching those goals. And then finally, the very important question of how you get faculty members to understand prior learning assessment and what it means to have college-level learning outside of classrooms, and how to engage them in a meaningful way throughout the process. So those are the three areas that we were interested in. And what we did actually to identify the institutions, we were very interested in not only identifying institutions who have been doing this work for quite some time. So the common institutions, which I'll list some in a few minutes, but we also were interested in those who were earlier on in the process to understand the opportunities and challenges that they face as they think about how to develop their academic models around prior learning. And so we developed a matrix, which is actually on page 9 of your report, if you want to look at it. And that helped us identify these institutions along these various points on the spectrum. And so the spectrum that we were interested in, again, ranged from new or emerging institutions who are just sort of entering into this space, on the other side of the spectrum, those who were more effectively doing these practices. And in each of the three areas. So one institution may be effectively doing something related to students, while another may be new or sort of trying to figure out how they want to develop or sustain their infrastructure. And so what we did is we identified a group of 7 diverse institutions, worked with them, engaged them to talk with a variety of administrators, faculty members, and staff to understand those very complex details that go into implementing and sustaining these initiatives on a campus. And so what I'll do now before I'll pass this off to my colleague Mary Beth is we want to also publicly thank the institutions that participated. And so they were the American Public University System, Fayetteville Technical Community College, Graceland University, Ivy Tech Community College, SUNY Empire State, and the University of Memphis. And so as you can see from that list, there's some institutions who have been engaged in this work for quite some time, names that often appear in the Credit for Prior Learning PLL spaces, and then others who are not as known in this space, but for us offer some important insights about what it means to get a program going, the challenges they face, and most importantly, the opportunities to innovate and think creatively about how to best serve post-traditional students. So Mary Beth will now share with you what we think are the important implications of this work, particularly for campus administrators, and as well as those setting larger policy at the state level, state and federal levels. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to have a mic that's right at my level. So, as Chris mentioned, our areas that we really focused on is infrastructure for credit for prior learning. So, we were really looking at some of the questions that have to do with sustaining credit for prior learning. So, how is that part of the mission or a strategic priority for an institution? What happens when the mission changes? What happens when senior leadership changes? So we begin to identify through that matrix that Chris mentioned, some of the elements of the infrastructure, some pretty obvious, from advising and outreach, to data collection, to the compiling or the organization of credit for prior learning policies and practices, also the organization and management of the related programs and services as well. So one of our findings was that all the institutions that we looked at were looking at more comprehensive policies and practices to better serve the diverse groups of students that were coming in. And there was more of a focus on what they call dedicated programs and services and a central point of contact, whether it was a centralized office or not. Some of our institutions obviously had more experience with this. Others were beginning to look at models for putting this together. And so they looked at lessons learned from student success centers or student veteran centers as well. So one of our thoughts is going forward is that a tool like the implementation matrix can help institutions assess where they are and what they need in order to build their infrastructure. So we're thinking about ways, and we invite your comments on that, about how to continue building those criteria, things that we can look at with institutions to help them build their infrastructure. And part of that infrastructure consideration, and this is a big deal for me, and I think Lewis talks about this a lot too, and that's navigation. Navigation for all stakeholders, students in particular, but also the people that work on college campuses, faculty, administrators, and staff. So a lot of the issues we see and we saw with institutions that we focused on in this study was that people get information accidentally or by chance. That was a couple of comments by institutions about their students, that they find out by accident what's going on with credit for prior learning, what their options are, how to get started. So one of the implications for us was to really think about, how do you build that information pipeline? How do you build it so that information is shared intentionally, is shared early on, and for students, that's before they even enroll. That sort of intentional outreach to help students and their employers know what the options are. And then often, so you may hear about it early on when you come on as a new faculty member or a new student, but we need to repeat that information throughout the academic career of a student and through the professional development of faculty and staff. Another area, and sometimes people talk about this area and they're gnashing their teeth and wringing their hands at the same time, but I'll call it faculty ownership. So one of the things we know from these institutions and other institutions is that faculty engage in credit for prior learning activities and assessment activities, and they do it often and they do it well. But we also know that there are challenges that remain in terms of faculty being engaged early on and often. I think there are challenges in terms of how faculty are engaged or invited to be engaged in policy and practice, and when that happens and how that happens. I also think there's another opportunity that our study talked about, and that's professional development. So we see that faculty are engaged in these activities, these policies and practices, and all kinds of assessment for all kinds of students. At the same time, what we learn from the institutions is that there may be, as with students, an orientation for faculty. So if you're a new faculty member at the beginning of the year, you might get some orientation about credit for prior learning. But again, it's not intentional, ongoing, consistent throughout the faculty member's life. So the challenge for us is to figure out how to embed that into professional development. And I think it raises bigger questions for faculty engagement that have to do with workload, incentives, part of the teaching, learning, assessment, life of faculty, recognition, and so forth. Chris mentioned earlier the different state and national initiatives, and I think some of those initiatives have brought forth some resources to help us take a closer look at metrics, which I think is really important. One of the things in terms of metrics that I think we want to look at is what's working as far as credit for prior learning assessment options and what's not working. And we can use metrics, I think, as kind of not only to improve what we do with students, but kind of an internal marketing. One of the things we found out with institutions is that if there's data collected, they're not sharing it with each other. And so that's another thing that could be part of the information pipeline and could help us understand what we need to invest in terms of credit for prior learning. So implications, if we were to look at, as Chris was talking earlier and Lewis as well, at CPL and CBE, credit for prior learning and competency-based education, we can look at it as, or I look at it anyway, as credit for prior learning intersecting that whole discussion about competencies and credits. And I think of three words, kind of start with T: transparency, translation, and transferability. And I think those three terms encompass what we need to do in terms of integrating credit for prior learning and competency-based education. So I could go on, but I'll leave it at that and let Lewis take over. Thanks.
And now we'll have a presentation of the currency of higher education paper, and I'll call up Deb Everhart, who is the, Director of Solution Strategy for Blackboard.
Thanks, Lewis. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors of our paper, Deb Seymour, who's here in the room and will be talking to us a moment about the implications of our research, and Karen Yoshino, who is the principal strategist at Blackboard. She has a university board meeting today, so she couldn't join us. So let me provide an overview of how this paper came about. Innovations in competency-based education have gotten a lot of attention, but we all know there are a lot of barriers to adoption and scalability. So to explore those barriers, hopefully find some solutions, in 2013 we began to talk about a joint effort with the American Council on Education and Blackboard to research some of these emerging trends. And as we started to do the research and were talking to CBE stakeholders, one practical impediment in our discussions was that not everyone was using the same terminology. And so this led to our development of clarifying competency-based education terms, a lexicon, which we released last August. It's been downloaded over 1,000 times now. And we hope that that's contributing to the field a shared vocabulary for discussion. Following the distribution of the lexicon, we held roundtables among subject matter experts, and our goal was to discern the main areas of interest and concern, the gaps that these higher ed CBE stakeholders faced. And this paper is really the result of those roundtables. We'd like to thank and acknowledge the scores of participants in those roundtables. They are thought leaders and practitioners in CBE, and they contributed many of the ideas in this paper, but they're not responsible for the synthesis and the conclusions, because as you know, there's a lot of debate in this field. So this paper, like the lexicon, is really designed to provide a framework for further discussion. So for example, if there are things in the paper or in the lexicon that you don't agree with, that's a great place to start a discussion. And particularly among those who are considering CBE programs at their own institutions. The work carries a Creative Commons license. We want people to remix and reuse it with attribution. We want everyone to use this material in their own ways. A key premise of the paper is that while credit hour processes are likely to remain deeply embedded in post-secondary systems for some time, there's a lot of opportunity for innovation with competencies as a parallel and complementary currency. Credit hours provide a basis for current models of exchange in higher education. The credits required for degree attainment, financial aid, transfers between institutions, and other critical functions. But competencies can provide representations of learning outcomes that are more flexible, more transparent. They can be applied in multiple contexts within and outside educational institutions. So this paper focuses on the complexity of implementing CBE flexible time practices in credit hour fixed time environments, and that reflects the challenges that were surfaced in our roundtable discussions. But this paper also helps us visualize new opportunities, and we provide scenarios that illustrate how competencies provide broad value in educational processes, not only as a means of documenting student achievement, but also to create meaningful connections between job seekers and employment, for faculty and staff development, and even for economic development. So the paper investigates social, practical, and policy implications of CBE, and Deb will talk more about that in a moment, and how credits and competencies both reflect important structures of value for diverse stakeholders. So the stakeholders in the scenarios we provide include government agencies, educational leaders and administrators, faculty, assessors, instructional designers, students, employers. Given the broad implications of long-standing federal, state, and institutional policies and practices based on the credit hour, the CBE faces fewer barriers for all of these stakeholders in these ecosystems when the outcomes-based approaches are compatible with the credit hour systems and processes. Federal guidelines for direct assessment and experimental sites. These are very important areas for exploration and experimentation, and these can provide a context for more extensive future changes in our educational systems. But in the short term, the reach of these initiatives will extend to very few students. And so we advocate that innovating within our existing structures is also an effective approach, and one that can provide rapid benefits for very, very large numbers of students. So a key question is, do we need a new currency for measuring post-secondary outcomes and achievement? Credits are well understood currency. They're used throughout administration, management, and funding processes. But systems of value in our educational ecosystems are changing in response to 21st century needs. The shift from industrial models of education to information age innovations is exposing fissures in systems that simply assume the value of credits. And so how can competencies provide a new currency that augments the value of credits in educational ecosystems? And how can competencies address the needs in very practical ways of 21st century stakeholders? So this paper walks through representative examples that illustrate how credits and competencies provide practical value and how they address, and in many cases fail to address, some of the critical needs of key stakeholders. The validation of credits and competencies and the evaluation of how well they meet the needs of 21st century educational ecosystems is complex and multifaceted. It emerges from shared values in communities of stakeholders. The validation requires collectively answering questions such as, do the credits or competencies accurately represent the learning achievements they're designed to represent? To whom are the credits or competencies meaningful? And how is that meaning applied in ways that provide value for stakeholders? Does the provider have the authority to issue the credits or the competencies? Has the learning represented by the competencies or currencies been accurately assessed? Are the credits or competencies valuable in contexts other than the institution that's issuing them? Are the learning achievements represented by the credits or competencies applicable in multiple contexts? And what is their exchange value in various contexts? Addressing these questions goes beyond the practical utility of credits or competencies in order to evaluate the breadth and the depth of their validation. As representations of learning achievements, they serve different purposes. Competencies are more variable, they're more prone to change over time than the fixed unit representation of credit hours. And that's both a strength and a weakness of competencies. Credits are more staid, but they're less transparent and flexible for use in contexts outside educational structures. So the requirements of a terminal credit hour-based degree can be relatively static for decades, providing stability and certainty for stakeholders in those educational ecosystems. But the cost of the stability can be stagnation, a lack of dynamic interactions between academic institutions and other stakeholders. And so the balance between the benefits of credits and competencies can provide a basis for ongoing revision, rejuvenation, and investments in innovation, making post-secondary credentials really living, breathing reflections of the needs of a 21st century world. Yep.
Good morning. So I've got a tough act to follow here. I've got had several very, very prolific speakers preceding me. But thank you all for being here, especially on a frigid day in February. And thank you to everybody who is tuning into our webcast. We hope the webcast is successful and everybody who's participating is able to hear and visualize everything that is occurring in this room at this time. As Deb had mentioned, I'm going to briefly discuss the implications of the research that we did and that were incorporated into the paper that we are in the process of publishing and releasing today. Essentially, we've divided the implications into three types of implications: practice implications, policy implications, and societal implications. And you will see if you read the paper that those implications are distributed throughout the paper. So they're not sort of stacked at the end, although we are presenting them in that fashion today. What I'm actually going to do is read some of these implications, and they're kind of chunky. But the alternative would have been to put them up on slides and flash them in front of you within 5 minutes flat. There's no way you would have been able to read them. So I'm going to actually read them, and there are ways of digesting these that would make them simpler to describe than simply reading what is actually in the paper. But that would have taken an hour, and we don't have an hour for this today. So I apologize for the type of presentation, and I encourage you to read the paper and, as Deb said, reflect on the content. Practice implications. CBE programs are challenged by systems integration, technology, and process adaptations needed throughout the student life cycle for scalability and efficacy. Processes and procedures already in place at post-secondary institutions may need upgrades, revisions, workflow changes, and innovative thinking. Quick comment on that particular implication. Most of what we heard from our roundtable participants involved the back-end work that is needed to transform a fully credit-based system into a competency-based system. That involves systems work, a lot of technology work, a lot of work for registrars in particular in how credits are evaluated as opposed to how competencies are evaluated, and particularly how everything gets transcripted. So that's a very important implication. Another one, competency-based models may address the issue of outcomes and achievement accountability with which institutions now struggle, as assessment and accountability are inherent in the structure of a competency framework. And Deb already addressed this in her short presentation. One of the advantages of a competency-based framework is that it does help to solve some of the challenges we have with a very fixed credit system. Competency-based systems and the disaggregation of the roles of faculty that occur in many competency-based systems offer renewal for faculty through a shift from being responsible for everything that occurs in a course to focusing on specific skills and passions. Some faculty members may be better at designing and curating powerful environments for students' construction of knowledge. Some faculty members might prefer mentoring. Some faculty members are better or prefer evaluating student performance. And finally, there is the role of evaluating overall program performance, and there are faculty members who have strengths in that area as well. Students need to know how they can evaluate the quality of CBE programs. stimulating discussions about how quality is defined in educational programs from the perspective of students. How do you explain to a student what a competency-based program is? All they're familiar with, their entire frame of reference, is based on the credit hour. Employers are key stakeholders both in the definition of CBE credentials and in the credentials marketability. And I think most people who are involved in competency-based work recognize this. One of the keys to a successful competency-based program is how it addresses the need for the student to go into the workforce. So the voice of the employer is critical. Badges and other micro-credentials can be useful bearers of competencies achieved, and as employers begin to accept their value, they can become part of the framework for competency exchange value. And this, of course, addresses the entire issue of stackable credentials, smaller micro-credentials, what can be achieved along the way. CBE provides educators with clear teaching targets and provides students with clear learning targets. Education thus can become demystified for all stakeholders, including employers. Of course, this is a goal. It doesn't mean that if you develop a competency-based program and you offer it within 6 months flat, you will have solved every single problem that exists on every single campus and has existed on every single campus for the past 200 years. There is no way anybody can make that claim, but there are definitely clarities that can be achieved through using a competency-based system. Moving on to policy implications. Because a competency-based system can make learning more visible, the portability or transferability issue, and this relates directly to credit for prior learning, particularly around basic skills assumed to be delivered through general education programs, could be greatly simplified. With minor differences between institutions and criteria for evaluating things like critical thinking, skills like written communication and information literacy, other types of skills like quantitative reasoning or oral communication or scientific reasoning, a competency-based medium for transfer could be much more straightforward than what we see in current practices. Another policy implication. Once CBE practices attain critical mass and establish productive business models, state and federal policy may begin to recognize and support the practice through policy shifts that reward transparency and performance. And one final policy implication. If competency-based systems are ultimately supported by federal and state policies to the extent that credit hour systems are supported by these policies, the systems can inform each other and work against the forces of stagnation and obsolescence. Moving on to the societal implications, and this will be very brief. Competency-based models open up possibilities for long-needed renewal of higher education and institutional opportunities to participate in transitioning from an industrial to an informational society, restructuring the economics of higher education, and democratizing access for underserved populations. Two more societal implications, and then I will turn this back over to Louis. The growth of CBE could lead to more dialogue between education and business, opening opportunities for business and industry to influence higher education beyond the current commercial partnerships in the higher education space. And finally, the technology and processes needed to implement CBE span the entire student life cycle, creating a need for industry-wide policy and practice strategies that reflect industrial to information age shifts. And then, of course, this directly relates to the discussion earlier by Louis of what the new machine age looks like. We can call it the information age and the machine age. It's actually probably information age 2.0 or 3.0 by now, however you prefer to think about it. But we certainly have seen rapid change both in education and in the labor force over the past 15, 20 years. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you to all the authors for presenting their papers. We had allowed about 10 minutes now for what we're calling clarifying questions. If you had a question about one of the papers specifically, please raise your hand. We'll do our best to I'll repeat the question. And if you direct it to one of the specific papers or authors, that would be much appreciated. So, Cliff? Yeah.
Mary Beth and Chris, that's the
Yes.
Okay. And this relates to.
Can you talk in the mic?
This is directed to Mary Beth and Chris, and in terms of the templates for credit for prior learning, specifically the French template, which is called la validation acquis d'expérience. And the way that works is that a mentor helps you prepare a dossier, and then the dossier goes to a jury for review in terms of whether they give you a degree or credits or something else. It depends on how it works. It's the same way an architecture studio jury works. Did you take this into consideration in light of your consideration for information navigation? Because there's a problem with this. There are virtues and limitations with the system. And one of the, just to illustrate fast, and then you can respond, 28,000, my most recent data, 28,000 adults in France, you've got to figure out how you got them in the first place, develop dossiers with mentors. Of those, they could only find juries for 21,000. So they lost a quarter of them right off the top, either because faculty were not qualified to do it or they didn't want to do it. How do you take account of this as a prerequisite to navigation, which was one of your principal and very fascinating points?
Well,
Mary Beth, come on. She can come up here.
okay. So I think time and labor is a big question, and I think particularly with that sort of system where there is the guidance of a mentor, which is really important. I think your points are really ones we have to consider in terms of putting a system together and navigate. So one of the things that I think maybe is a strength and a weakness of our system is that we have a variety of options that we can use. So in putting together something like that, maybe we look for ways to streamline and combine methods. And that's what I was talking about earlier with the translation, that there are crosswalks that we can look at, both in terms of CPL and CBE, where there's third-party validation or industry-recognized credentials that are that stand up on their own and maybe do not involve as much work or as much mentoring as, say, an individual portfolio or dossier would require. So I think, combining the methods is helpful, but then also thinking about how the information is provided to the public so that they understand and are able to come forward with whatever method you put together. I honestly don't see us using a system here like that. I don't think we have the capacity or would build the capacity to do it. To do a system that you mentioned. And I think that goes beyond information sharing. It's part of having the resources to have those individual mentors. So I think our challenge is not only sharing the information, but building the capacity to guide students through. And that process that you described is very time intensive and requires a lot of people. And do you see us doing that here?
Well, I mean, how else do you get 28,000 students to start with?
As I was listening to both Cliff's question and Mary Beth's response, it occurred to me that it's at the intersection of the practice implications and societal implications from the other paper. Any other clarifying questions before we move? I'll come over here to Roy, and if you can get him a microphone. Just if you say which paper it's for, which author
Actually,
it's
it
for.
could be for both papers, seems like. And the clarifying question is that it seems like assessment is a general theme in faculty development. Being able to, it's one thing to quantify the prior learning and then coming out of the military system for 28 years of one of the biggest competency-based educators in this country. It seems like we have a major staff development, actually goes back to the preparation of teachers in this country, that the assessment component is extremely weak, and one that appears, based on your implications, that we really need to concentrate in a variety of ways. So I'd like their comments on that.
Sure. Would someone come on up?
So I have the privilege of being an author on both papers. I'm very, very fortunate. So I actually can address that. Thank you, Roy. Thanks for laughing. In any event, we do think that assessment is a huge component in the work going forward. And it's directly tied to outcomes. So the way we envision the world of higher ed going forward is that the voices at the table for developing outcomes grow to include employers. Those voices grow to include inputs other than just the voice of the one instructor who is developing and teaching the course. Disaggregation of faculty roles eventually could grow to include folks who are not traditionally thought of as faculty, and including employers' voices at the table and developing outcomes and how those are assessed becomes critical. Just one quick note on that, we already see this in practice with apprenticeships that are tied into community college work. We know that many community colleges who are accepting credits for apprenticeships from the workforce are actually using the people running those apprenticeships as instructors within the community college. So we know that assessment is a huge piece of this, and that the voices developing the outcomes and assessment need to grow. I hope that helps to answer the question. Thanks.
I'll come to one further reflection before I forget. One of the reasons we asked the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment to be on the panel today was, in our discussions with the authors, it occurred to us that while we've been talking about competency a lot, the broader issue of the evolution of assessment is less visible in the public discourse. Andrew?
I have a question about the credit for prior learning paper, and just curious about the findings that you encountered with regard to transferability from the sides of those entering the institution, transferring to other programs at an institution, and then leaving to other institutions. What structural findings or challenges did you encounter, and what was being done about them?
Chris, you want to come up over there? Okay.
Well, I don't think our findings with this small group would be surprising. So within the systems themselves, there were issues in terms of transferability. For example, with one statewide system, there were not the same practices or transfer going on within that system. And so I think that along with Cliff's question about navigation and how do you get everybody on board, and guide them. One of the other big challenges for us is transferability. I think some of the initiatives that we're seeing on the statewide and multi-state collaborative level are very promising. So if you look at some of them are funded by private foundations like Lumina, some are state guided. So you see those across the United States, and you see state systems like Tennessee and Wisconsin and Washington State working on that transferability issue just within the system. And then you see a multi-state collaborative like in the Midwest for military credit, and looking at establishing those policies and standards and practices within their own states, but then looking at how do you go across states as well. So it's slow, but it's promising as well. And I think the metrics piece, as these states start collecting and showing what they're doing across CPL options, what's working for those students, who's persisting, who's graduating, that's going to be helpful as well. But it's a gnarly issue still. Thanks.
Other clarifying questions? Paper? No? Okay, then I'd like to invite the panelists to join me up on the stage. And I hope I'm still mic'd. I believe I am. And
Green,
Yes. So by way of introduction, I'll start to my immediate left with Mike Riley, who is the Executive Director of ACRA, the Association of Admissions and Registrars. Natasha Jankowski, who is the Associate Director at the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. Charlotte Long, who's an independent consultant, but recently Emeritus Dean from Lipscomb University. and Charlie Johnstone, the Vice President of Academic Advancement at Western Governors University. Thank you all for joining us. And I'd like to start by picking a panelist at random to react to the papers. So I'd like to start with Charla.
I had a feeling I was going to be the at random person. I tried that approach that we use in college, where if you don't look at the teacher, they may not call on you. But it didn't work there either. So that's the person I'm always looking for. I would say I think both papers from a practitioner standpoint were right on. When I read the credit for prior learning piece, I have to say, as somebody who instituted a prior learning assessment policy at Lipscomb University, I could have said I identify with most of those 7 schools. I think your rubric was helpful in being able to say, where am I on that? Are we emerging, or are we more developed, or are we really best practice? I think that can be helpful to the institutions. So I think there's a lot of great utility there in that piece. The other piece on credit and competencies and the new currency and thinking that through really revealed some of the biggest challenges that institutions are facing, right? A lot of us can be innovative and can come up with these great ideas, but being able to move an entire system is incredibly challenging. Not just our own institution, but then thinking about how we fit that innovation into public policy and how we try to bring about that kind of change. So many of us enjoy engaging with employers and bringing them to the table and creating programs that reflect the needs of a workforce in the 21st century. But what we often find is then trouble, with not only accreditors, but also with federal agencies and state agencies in making all that happen. So I thought you did a good job of pointing that out. I have a full page of notes of things to talk about, but that'll get us maybe started and me off the hook.
Great. And Mike, thank you. That was great. And Mike, as you digested the papers and listened to the presentations, you're looking at it from a different point of view. Your members are the folks that are, taking on the admission side and the registrar side. In many ways, you reflect that back end of these processes. And the interaction between the academic side of the house and the more administrative side of the house that would help to adopt and adapt the processes to do this. So what are your initial reflections and thoughts?
Well, I thought they were both papers were very thoughtful. And both of them intersected with a lot of the work that we're doing right now, the conversations we're having. Over time, we're sort of responsible for what the current transcript looks like, because that's the guidance that we provide to our members. But we came to that through many, many years of practice and convergence, and now we're finding this kind of new realm about competencies and prior learning assessment, in the desire to try to rapidly put standards around it, and we're just not there. So we found it really. I found that both papers really interesting, and again, I keep circling back to this assessment question and the importance of that. I think about when distance education first came out. In our practice, we used to transcript it very differently as this distinctly different beast, and it would cause problems with transfer because some campuses would say, well, we don't take distance ed or recognize it, and over time discovered that the outcomes were the same, so we don't make those distinctions anymore. And I think we can get to those kinds of results by focusing on the assessment more so than the methodology or other things. So I think there's a lot of good work here. I was thinking, just quickly, we had a good conversation with Elena Silva from Carnegie as she was helping to develop the paper that just came out. And when she got to us, she'd been reflecting on talking with a lot of faculty and people getting innovative and exciting to get away from the credit hour, and we must have sounded like just the proverbial, I won't say what we sounded like, but we start pointing at the practical applications or implications. So we're trying to be, help facilitate these conversations and make them productive, because I think this will ultimately lead to a currency where outcomes and competencies, I think, are transferable and uniformly recognized.
I want to follow on, but Kathy, Sally's dying to jump in here, so go ahead.
No, I have an interesting little anecdote or lesson or whatever that picks up on the issues that Mike was just talking about. As Lewis mentioned, we've been at WGU, Western Governors University, we've been working with actually close to a dozen community colleges across the country for the last 2 years on what I consider the real pragmatic issues. Our challenge in this was to try to figure out how do you take a state agency, keep it out of my hand, see if it works.
Is it green, Sally?
It is now.
Okay.
The interesting part of this was, think of community colleges as state agencies. That means they have to adhere to all the regulatory and process and everything else that is part of their state framework. But in addition to that, they have local policies. Many of them have their own boards, they have their own everything. And when you start thinking about some of the things that the two Debs put together in their project, or their paper, I'm sure, yes. In their paper, looking at the real pragmatic back office issues. And that's really what we were trying to discover. So for 2 years, well, actually the first year, these colleges worked really hard to figure out how they were going to create competency-based education programs. They did. They now have thousands of students enrolled, by the way, and these are across the country, among them. But the interesting part of this is, how do they solve those challenges so that we really are talking about, not talking about it, but doing it in terms of how do you really integrate CBE program that is flipping time and mastery, in which students are working independently, well, not independently, but working at their own pace. It has to fit within all the frameworks that already exist. Oh, this is not a happy one, huh? Okay. We'll just set that there and, go to the rock star image here. But how do they do that? How do they integrate all this stuff? And one of the lessons we picked up on was, of course, how in the world do you keep track of what the student is doing when your back office systems, as Deb and Deb pointed out, are not designed to let students work at variable rates? What do you do? How does it work? And everyone solved it differently. And by the way, we do have a website up with these lessons. It's just www.cbeinfo.org, so cbeinfo.org. But I wanted to tell a story about one of the colleges and their registrar, because all the registrars had to be involved in the discussions that went on with the academic units, as well as with the planning groups and the support groups across these campuses. And at Sinclair College in Ohio, their solution for the first term, and this was kind of a pilot thing, they had under 100 students in their first group of students that came through. They did all the record keeping in the registrar's office by hand. Now, I, of course, was a little nervous about that, and we talked about it, and my colleague there, Nancy Tebow, who's managing the project at Sinclair, said, Sally, we have to do it by hand to start with so that we understand the system. By the second term, they had automated it. They built workarounds to their SIS, Student Information System, and were able to then have an automated structure, and they now have, I'm not even sure what the total number is, but hundreds of students in that program. And it was because they started by hand to understand what their registrar's office had to do in order to be able to track these students that were not fitting into the normal pattern for which all the back office systems had been designed. So there are solutions.
And one of the fascinating things about that example is that, from a policy perspective, and for the pressures that, and political, the pressures that tend to come from outside of the academy and outside of institutions, are not necessarily cognizant of those types of necessary learnings and changes as time goes on. But Natasha, I want to turn to you for a second. I want to shift a little bit. You've been listening for a long time. NALOA has been thinking for a few years about how assessment is evolving and how do we develop standards around this. And I truly believe it's one of the silent conversations we haven't been having, at least in the public discourse. I believe practitioners are having those conversations. So as you've been listening both to this conversation, but also reacting to the more public discourse that I'm sure you're hearing around the campuses and the provosts you work with, what are your initial thoughts?
First of all, thank you so much for having us a part of this conversation, because in my mind, these are not even thank you so much for having assessment as part of this conversation. And in our work, these two papers are very interrelated in how people experience and practice this. And so it's wonderful to see them grouped in this way. But I think from my perspective in working with institutions and tracking, how are they approaching assessment? What are they thinking about in relation to this? This fits very well with where currently the thinking is moving towards assessment in the field. One thing that I think is important to remember is that assessment is a moving field. There's not one way to do it. It's not, we've decided a way that we're going to do it and that's how it's always going to be. So we've been doing surveys of how are institutions engaging with assessing student learning, and it's very different over time. And where we currently sit now is a very supportive place for the type of initiatives that these papers are talking about, that we're looking at a faculty, we're looking at institutions that are in a much more receptive position for this. And just as an instance of that, we did a survey in 2009 and a survey in 2013 of how are institutions assessing student learning. The use of portfolio jumped 400% at an institution level, right? If you're thinking about credit for prior learning, and one of the ways of engaging with that is portfolios, if you as an institution haven't engaged with this and don't understand how to use it, that's a problem. Once you see more traction in the assessment field of understanding these approaches, you have a huge difference there. External performance assessments jumped like 150% in the use that's happening at institution levels. Another thing that's related to these initiatives, employer surveys, rubrics, all of these are areas in which institutions had huge changes in the amount that was using it, their understanding of it, and how they were involving faculty. So I think what you see happening is a field that is primed in a lot of ways to have these conversations in elements and with people that they hadn't been able to do before. One other point, I think, and if Becky Klein-Collins from Cale wrote a lovely occasional paper for us on CBE and prior learning assessment. And so if you want to see more of her perspectives on that would be wonderful. You can go to our website and read all about it. But one of the things that I think that really sets up the shifts in assessment that support this work, but also these conversations nationally so that more innovation can happen in a scalable kind of way, is the focus on every student. So you also see happening in assessment a shift from, well, how can I say as an institution that our students are learning? So I can take a sample and, give you some information on that, or I can say my programs are doing okay because we looked at a couple capstone experiences, to saying, no, we need to know because our students move. They come from all kinds of places. They learn in all different ways. How do we know that every single student coming through is getting the knowledge and skills, are able to do and apply all of these things in different ways? And that requires a very different type of assessment, that requires faculty conversations that clarify outcomes in a way that we all understand and agree. Cliff Edelman just wrote a lovely paper for us on how to write these things in ways that you can have these conversations. But these are happening. And that's sort of the backdrop that you really need in the assessment field to set up these types of innovations to move forward in a very productive way from the assessment side of things.
One of the questions that always occurs to me is, what's the nature of leadership? Where if you have some leading edge institutions across any of the experiences you have, what's the nature of the leadership involved, and how does that leadership lead to sustained change? Right? Is it a leader, a president, a provost, or do you from dealing with your members or the folks you work with internal to your organizations, what are you seeing are the keys? And by way of an example, we're doing a project on financial data. And we've been having a conversation about how the nature of the relationship between a president, a provost, and a CFO needs to begin to change at a campus for both administrative process change and academic process change. And in the context of CBE and CPL, are there some things you're seeing around the leadership and sustained change that we might discuss as commonalities?
I'm sorry. I have one point. I think I'll buy you guys some time. No. So one thing that I think we see happening very frequently is leaders stepping back and saying it's not my space to say you need to do this, but it's my role to say I'm going to create space in which you can have this conversation and own it. And so marking off time, allowing space for reflection, and really saying, you know, I support this as important work, so I'm going to have that space created has been the role of leadership that's been very successful in these areas. The other part of that, though, is a notice, a perspective shift on the part of institutions that takes on a very systemic view. And this is that while this is owned by faculty and driven by faculty in a lot of ways, our students experience our institutions, however that may be defined, in a myriad of different ways. This involves thinking about how does the student move through and experience that learning environment, and where are all the different places that learning might happen, and how do we involve all those different stakeholders in these conversations, so it becomes a much more collective group process. And when you have a collective group ownership like that, it inherently becomes more sustainable because it's not the purview of one office. It's not the purview of one person. You actually create shared understanding of what you're trying to do, what the value and purpose of this is, how everyone works together as part of a collective whole to really help students succeed. And so in that sense, it's a different sort of perspective on what the roles and responsibilities of different players are.
You want to go like this one?
I want
Sally,
to echo that and basically sum it up by saying a really good leader becomes the prime mover and gets out of the way.
Just in our space, there's one illustration. The University of California at San Diego right now is doing some interesting things, and it's coming from the leadership of the president and the mission and vision of statement of the university, and such that they're really trying to capture a much broader range of experiences for students. So, you know, another dimension of this conversation that we're working with are co-curricular experiences that are happening on campuses. A lot of interest now on capturing those so that when a student leaves, you can demonstrate your civic engagement, your social, your volunteerism, et cetera. So they're doing some really creative things focused on the mission of the institution, driven by the executive leadership. The provost office also very involved. They're going to be coming out with a co-curricular record, giving students an opportunity to do an e-portfolio and a much enhanced digital transcript. I don't think they're working in the competency or learning outcome space yet, but creating this digital platform will allow them to do that.
Go ahead, Charlotte. Then
I was going to say one more thing about that. All of that sounds great. It's really hard to walk out on a campus because at some point the faculty will say no, right? And if you have a shared governance or a faculty governance situation, it makes it very challenging. And so you'll see some CBE institutions have said, we're going to do that as a separate institution, right? So Southern New Hampshire started College for America because it was faster for them to innovate, right? So I agree that mic goes out again. I agree that you have to bring everyone with you, but it takes a really long time, and it's almost up to what your leader's appetite is for that, because you can do it faster, but you're going to alienate along the way, and then you've got to figure out how you bring people back in. So at Lipscomb, even though we had a place in which to do that, and had the authority to move on without faculty consent, I wouldn't do that. We had to continue to work all my other deans to make sure we had the support we needed so that we could move it as fast as we possibly could. But it's challenging. We see a lot of institutions that are driven by personalities, a leader, you know, who has a strong personality. I think that's a risk, right? We have to have a strong leader, but it can't only be that person. And so that would be my caution on that.
Oh, thank you for that. You want to go ahead, Sally?
Pick up on Charlotte's point and go back to my little team of partner community colleges around the country. I think Charlotte's point is well taken. The easiest way to start a terrifically innovative program, and in our case, it was obviously around competency-based education, is create something new. But if the objective of the leader is to actually help guide the institution into a new world or a new set of tools or a new, arrow in the quiver to allow that institution to be able to function in new ways as it moves into the future, then creating a separate entity, as Charla pointed out, is not always the best long-term strategy. And that was part of why all of the colleges with which we were working did it inside the college. Now, they had different strategies within each of the colleges, and you can look at those as that website continues to develop, but we're also putting out articles about what they did and how they did it. But the issue around it is it's worth doing the tough work that Charla was suggesting of whatever you're working with, whether it's deans or whether it's within a single program within a college, getting the innovators among the faculty engaged. And even in faculty union environments, there are still people who want to play in different ways, and you find the individuals that are willing to play, but in addition to that, you find the ways to work around the bargaining, the contracts that you have in place. Let's put it that way.
So, Natasha, go ahead, please.
I just want to make one point on faculty briefly. I think this is a point of mine, so I apologize just temporarily, but I think faculty get a bad rap a lot of times. And so I just want to say that most of the time faculty fears on this work are incredibly real. They can point to a place where this has been used against them. They can point to someone that got fired because of this. And so if you're like, no, it's fine, that's not here, they don't really believe you, and they have good reason to. And so I think it's very useful in this work to out from the get-go, and then the papers, this was very clear, to frame what is the value and the purpose, that this is actually putting things back in the hands of faculty that a lot of unbundling and different situations have removed, that this is incredibly central to the work that they're doing. And right from that get-go, being very upfront and honest and hearing faculty and the fears that they have, listening to the complaints, because most of the complaints are very specific. This form doesn't capture what I'm doing. This way we've been operating doesn't really reflect my students. Listening to that and honoring that and understanding that overcoming and having that as part of the conversation is actually beneficial to move forward can be hugely impactful. That's not to say that there aren't still going to be some that you need to work around, but having that space is part of it, that this is something that really gives power back to faculty in ways that they have been concerned and have been taken away, can be hugely helpful to moving forward.
Just one observation about policy from the outside in, that, as we talk about whether you're doing innovation inside an existing institution or you see a need to set up institutions outside, one of the things that policy is still wrestling with is this idea, and Bob Zemsky writes about this well at Penn. If we've reached a point in higher ed's been evolving and changing for centuries, right? So slowly, we might argue, but and Bob Zemsky says, we need a new way of thinking about how the next institutional forms evolve. Some will evolve from existing institutions, others will be new types of institutions. We're getting at that with experimental sites and things like that. But, I've often felt that policy hasn't really totally acknowledged yet that new institutional forms are a part of what it should be thinking about when we think about Title IV and HEA generally. And I want to come back to Mike, then I'll introduce policy again later. So as your members wrestle with what a transcript needs to look like, and when you were speaking about the experiment in California or what's happening in California, I was reflecting on Deb and Deb's paper about societal impacts. If you start producing different transcripts, it means that HR people somewhere at a company have to be able to look at that transcript and know what it says, or look at a resume that's built off that transcript. And are your members are they having those types of conversations with each other so that as you're being asked, there's pedagogical innovation happening, on the other side of the house, and you're being asked to represent that in ways that document the learning that happened at the institution, but also provide that student with either the bits of information they need for further education or for an employer. Well, what's happening in that space for you guys?
Yeah, it's moving really quickly. I mean, one of the feedback that we're getting is lots of campuses, certainly those that are doing direct assessment, those are the ones that are bright, shiny things getting all the attention. But there's a whole lot of other stuff going around. Campuses doing the degree qualifications profile or the LEAP framework. They're approaching the registrar saying, we want to be able to document this for a student so that she can take it with her. What do we do? So, to avoid a little bit of a Tower of Babel, which could be something of a problem, we're actually working with NASPA because we're bringing in this co-curricular conversation as well to see what a document might look like. One model we've been exploring is what they're doing in the UK, the HERE report, which is their higher education academic report, which is a diploma supplement as part of the Bologna compliance, but it has really nice learning outcomes described, a transcript that has is really creative co-curricular experience. Now, there's some things that don't work for us. These outcomes are fixed, and everybody who starts at UK institutions tends to graduate from the same institution. You may notice we don't do that in America. You actually have to bring these things around in various stages of completion. So we're suggesting right now, at least our initial framework that we're working on, would keep these documents somewhat separate. Don't make the academic transcript overly complicated. Despite its critiques, it still works well to let students move between institutions. I'd argue the transcript is less of a problem for credits not transferring than institutional philosophies and policies, to be honest. And let the innovation take place in these learning documents that describe outcomes, et cetera. So we actually think we'll have a framework probably about midsummer and hopefully get some pilot schools to try that. And we want to do it in a digital format. That's another thing to keep in mind. Right now, we're really pushing the digital exchange to improve mobility, and suddenly you go into a narrative sort of approach that complicates it. But there's a whole lot of work being done on standardizing the exchange of narrative descriptions. The PESC group has just recently come up with a course inventory that will allow you to do that.
Like, just let me reflect on one thing again. So in that process that you're going through, is it mostly just your members and is it intra-institution? So are employers involved in that? How are you communicating with that outside world about whether or not they can interpret it yet? Or is it too early to do that?
I think it's a bit early. I mean, our members, just so you know, we look to the faculty. That's who we tend to report to through the academic line, and we're trying to, work with their practice. So I think they're still trying to define learning outcomes and competencies. Whether those are related to employment, I think is something we've not dove into. I'd like to say I stay out from between the dog and that tree right now from just the registrars. I'll let them sort that out, but then we can find ways to operationalize it. But I think that's a critical part. Community colleges do a whole lot better job of that than baccalaureates do right now.
Sally, and then Charla.
I want to echo Mike's perspective on this because I think it's really critical. And we know that in American higher education, students swirl. Thank you, Cliff. What was that, 12, 15 years ago? Yeah. But the notion is they're transferring in and out of institutions. And at the very beginning of Western Governors University, which had the advantage of being able, we got to develop it from scratch, sort of. And the issue was it was going to be totally competency-based, which it still is. But we were using more of a UK model of what does a course look like. And a course might be a combination of a lot of different, what we think of as topic areas or curricular areas that are bundled together. And an individual course could be worth anywhere from 9 competency units, which is what we call them, we still do, to 10 or 12 or whatever. And it didn't take very long for the people that were building WGU and making it happen for students to realize that was a trap for students in American higher ed. And it was a trap because how in the world do you transfer in a course that's only part of one of these other courses? And how in the world do you transfer the courses that were taken in this unique environment to other institutions? So over the last 18 years, WGU's courses have evolved in terms of content to look very much like courses at most other campuses across the country. Students still don't earn credit hours, they earn competency units, and they earn them in very different ways, and the courses are developed in very different ways, and it's a totally disaggregated faculty, and it's a team approach, not a solo sport, with regard to how in the world you're going to both determine what students are going to learn, what are they going to use to learn it, and how are you going to measure it. But within that, at the end of the day, we need to be providing students with something, as Mike wisely pointed out, is legible to other institutions. In addition to that, back to the employer notion that Lewis brought up, this was pointed out to me in a similar kind of discussion in the last month or two, that at the moment, employers, because of electronic applications, no longer get just a couple of applicants for any position. They get hundreds or thousands of applicants for a position. And the chances that they are going to wade through a competency-based transcript are minuscule. I mean, even now they might look at, have I heard of the college from which this individual graduated? You know, is it accredited? Does it make sense? Does the name of the degree somehow fit what we're talking about? But the notion that employers in our current world are going to get to the level of detail that theoretically might be interesting to have them have, I'm being told is just unrealistic.
We're getting some pretty provocative questions from our online audience, so I'm going to get a few of those in before we move to our audience Q&A here. So, is there a one-sentence response to faculty who still believe that PLA and CBE are selling credits? One sentence?
No, there isn't a one-sentence response. Yeah.
If it's rooted in quality assessment, no.
And I would argue that, we've raised this dichotomy, and our friends in the federal government have raised the dichotomy about CBE versus direct assessment. I think it's an artificial dichotomy, but we won't go there in great detail. But the notion here is selling credits. At WGU, a student comes into the program, they are taking courses like they would anywhere. They're just doing it differently, and they can accelerate. They can use information that they've already had or courses they've taken in the past or work experience to move through a course at a much faster rate. But the nice part about it is we know that every student who progresses through a program has mastered all the material in that course. I can't say that for public or private institutions around the country with which I've had any involvement, because it's still a solo sport. And if I'm going to grade somebody in one way in my course and another section of that course, the student is graded in a different way, how does the institution stand behind whatever it is that comes out of it? There's no consistency. So I don't think it's selling credits. And our students say that our programs are harder than what they've experienced in their previous college experiences where they're transferring in courses.
Natasha, it looks like you wanted to get in.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise a point. I think what's incredibly helpful, especially with a question like that, is to have faculty or others talk to students from these programs, because the students' ability to reflect and talk actively about their learning, their knowledge, and their skills is incredibly different from when you talk to a student in a more traditional program. They're much more aware, they're much more reflective, they have a language that they can then engage with employers. They could probably write that narrative on their transcripts in ways that others can't. And so I think one way, a very sort of useful way to alleviate some concerns is to have faculty talk to students that come from this about their learning, and that's sort of like, I guess the proof is in the pudding, I think, in that instance.
One of the other questions is how do you feel CBE might influence the move towards the free community college plan? Go, Charlie. You want go?
I might try it. I come from Tennessee, where our governor got a great deal of attention for the Tennessee Promise, and I can say, as a 4U institution who didn't have an associate's program, for example, that was a concern when that came out in our state for our institution and for other for your institutions. The way we handled it is kind of twofold. One is that I don't want to compete with a community college. I think community colleges do great things. What we'd like to do is try to build on that. And so we structured our competency-based program as really an associate's to bachelor's program so we can continue to lead people through. We also did and are working on reverse articulation agreements. So we know that there are certain competencies that if a community college student possesses these, they're more likely to persist to graduation, which is very important to our community colleges. And so we are actually assessing their students in our assessment center and helping develop those competencies while they're actually at the community college, reverse articulating those credits back to those programs to try to help drive them through our community college. So it's not an adversarial process. It's really about how do we all keep working together to raise the ship, right?
And go ahead,
just
Mike.
One
please.
quick point. One possible benefit might be the Dear Colleague letter that came out in December about competency-based education referred to the challenges around using federal financial aid for PLA. In fact, it's very difficult to do unless there's a good engagement. Well, if it were free, might have a platform for more students to engage in the campuses to get involved in competency-based education because the student doesn't need to be financed to engage in that. So that might be an interesting intersection.
Great. One last question I had, as we're seeing competency-based education and credit for prior learning spotlighted, in fact, many of them have been around both of them have been around for quite some time. They're not new. I'm wondering, as folks who are wrestling with some of the challenges of their latest iteration or their latest evolution, is higher ed, our faculty, for an example, but not exclusively, administrators, leaders, are we evolving also the competence within institutions to continue to deal with pedagogical change? Oftentimes when I've been to credit for prior learning convenings and competency-based education convenings, and I'm always struck that folks are doing a lot of work. There's a lot of work, faculty members, deans, and wondering if the general level of competence about dealing with pedagogical change is going up. Just if you could reflect on that.
Thanks. Louis, what I think we saw starting, 15, 20 years ago, when distance learning became something everybody felt like they had to get involved with, it was a rise in the number of campuses that chose to create support units around helping faculty and others figure out how you design an instructional environment that isn't a classroom. So we saw the rise of support systems for distance learning, which included instructional designers, read that, pedagogy experts, and in addition to that, they became service units to the rest of the institution, be it a college or a university. What we're starting to see, and we've seen this with the colleges that we've been working with for the last couple of years, most of them are building on, if they had a distance learning support unit, building on that to now plug in not just instructional designers, but experts in assessment, so psychometricians, or at least people who are well versed in what does it mean to assess students and what are the right kinds of assessments that we need in that. So that I think what I would predict will evolve are these support units that include the expertise that our subject matter experts, read that, faculty, are never going to fully become experts in, because that's not what they're trained to do. They are experts in the field in which they were educated. But as these support units develop, they will include not only the pedagogical issues or expertise with instructional designers, but if I were a young person right now and wanted to make my career in higher ed, I'd, move into psychometrics.
It's exciting. I asked because in the innovation literature, it's clear that ability to continuously learn and continue to build competence actually is what leads to the next innovation, even though it's invisible to most outside viewers of that process.
I was just saying, I think we could moderate a couple elements of our narrative describing CBE as a radical departure from what we're currently doing and the evils of seat time. You know, you're not measuring learning. I thought registrars would say, well, if we're measuring seat time, we should have been taking attendance, which very few campuses do, and instead of, you know, figuring out these processes to let faculty give us grades. So I just think those kinds of, that this totally radical isn't helping the adoption curve when faculty are sort of characterizes what they've been doing has been ineffective.
Go ahead, Natasha.
I would,
Inexpensive.
Yeah.
I'm in thinking about the institutions that we sort of track and what's going on in relation to this. I would say I think there is a place that people are getting to sort of shared competence and building off of this in really interesting ways. There's a lot of institutions that are starting to be like, we actually need to work as consortia to figure things out because these problems are bigger than our institution alone. And so once you start to see those kinds of things happening, you see a lot of uptake. But I think there's also realizations occurring in the field that's like you need to be at a certain level with your assessment to be ready to move into this work. And so this idea of sort of institutional readiness to advance is really moving in a lot of ways. And one of the things we've seen really push that is institutions work with the degree qualifications profile. And so, and because it just requires a space to reflect on why are we doing what we're doing? And have we designed this in a way to do what we want to have happen with students? And that's not a question that we generally have space or time to engage with. And so having that happen really, I think, has led to a place where it's a philosophical shift, but once it happens, you can't undo it. You can't unsee it. And that's very positive, I think, to see this move forward.
I did want to open it up to the audience. We have at least one mic out there because we took one up here. So why don't we go over here to Tom Rudin?
Hi, thank you. Tom Rudin with the National Academy of Sciences. In this report, they have a little joke in the beginning about a traditional college person saying people should go to a four-year college because it's all about relationships. And that issue is quickly dismissed. I think it should be dismissed because we're in a different world now. But one of the things we're beginning to hear from employers is it's all about relationships. We've asked employers, hey, what kind of STEM skills do you need from people coming out of college? And some of them are saying, I don't care about their STEM skills. I need people who can come and look me in the eye and explain a problem, who can work with a team and be a good team player. I don't care if they ever know, I don't even care if they know how to turn on a computer. So how do you reconcile digital competency-based learning, which is a lot of time at a computer, with this need to be part of an interactive team and really develop your team skills?
Who would you want to take it on, Charlie?
I might try if I could. I don't think it's your last little statement about it's all at a computer is not necessarily true of all models, right? So there's a lot of variety in how we see CBE done in America today, but they're not all in a single individual sitting in front of a computer, and there's a lot designed into that. I can speak for our program that we use a behavioral assessment model in which students are behaviorally assessed for things like team skills, conflict management. Why did that go off again? Team skills, conflict management, diplomacy skills, being able to interact with other people, problem solvers, creative thinkers, all of that is being assessed in an 8-hour assessment process. We award badges out of that allow employers to understand how good this person is in team player abilities. We give a dual transcript that gives the behavior statements that we expect if they've earned that level. So I'm seeing more of my colleagues, for example, our Dean of Engineering came and said, can you start assessing my engineering students on that stuff, like team player, et cetera, because we need to know, can they communicate when they get in the work environment? So we talked to Sally's point earlier about the CBE program starts to be a resource to the other parts of the institution. We're seeing that in IT, we're seeing it in our sciences field, healthcare, engineering, all of those are beginning to embrace. Can you give me that behavioral assessment and help me figure out how I can develop that alongside the content that we're teaching in the STEM program or whatever else program? So I think you'll see more and more models that can really speak to that in specific fields as well.
Coming from an institution that is completely online, our students don't work directly or face-to-face with faculty. They do it by phone, by webinar, everything else, and they meet at commencement. We find, not anecdotally, but by hiring external evaluators to talk to employers. So we use Harris polling to survey employers of our graduates. And the employers tell us that our graduates, who it's all online, have a higher level of soft skills than the average graduate coming out of a face-to-face environment. Now, why would that be the case? Well, a part of it is these are adult students, but another big part of this is we build it into our curriculum. So even though it's online, they're learning to work in teams that are virtually connected, which for many of the people coming out of higher education right now is how they will be working. They will be working with people that they never see. So being able to know how to do that and work effectively in a virtual team is a very important soft skill that can be accomplished. So I would argue that you're absolutely right, terribly critical, but we need to build it into the curriculum, whether it's online or face-to-face or done in the way that Charla has suggested.
One more.
I have to have one more line, I'm sorry. The piece on that, for example, I went to our Dean of IT and he said all of our people are team players. How do you know that? How do you know you're graduating team players? Where do you assess it? What is your rubric for that? Well, it's part of our learning outcomes, yeah, but where do you assess it and how do you develop it, right? And so I think in traditional programs, we say we're teaching soft skills, but back to your point on assessment, if you don't have a strong assessment that has that person be able to demonstrate it and then to be able to go in and remedy where they're deficient, then we really haven't taught it. We've just said that that's part of the learning outcomes. So I think it goes back to your assessment point.
There was one back here before I went over, right there, Jarrett.
Hi, Jarrett Cummings with EDUCAUSE. And to amplify a point Sally made, I mean, I think one of the key elements about teaching and learning with technology is we no longer take for granted that relationship development happens. Whereas in a face-to-face environment, we assume just because people are in the same place at the same time that relationships are actually being developed and people are communicating. And that's not often the case. But something you said earlier, Sally, in terms of talking about the development of shadow systems to launch the start of these programs struck me because as the Association for IT and Higher Education, I would say the entire history of administrative technology has been trying to move us beyond shadow systems and integrate those functions into the core system so that they're sustainable. The exponential growth in overhead over time is incredibly painful for an institution. So what lessons learned are you seeing yet, if any, from the community colleges or other institutions that are trying to, they've got to launch with a shadow system, but at some point they have to engage with their administrative technology and administrative systems providers to bring this in or it won't be sustainable.
I absolutely agree with you. And there's a little article that a colleague and I, Leo Rakliotis, did for EDUCAUSE Review on some of those issues, about a year ago. But I want to tell the story of Western Governors University here. Okay, it started about 18 years ago. We now have, by the way, almost 55,000 students. It's relatively cheap, under $6,000 a year. You can take as many courses as you are able to accomplish in that time frame, on and on and on. But the important lesson with regard to shadow systems is there was nothing out there 18 years ago that could in any way track what this institution was trying to do. So it wasn't just shadows. We built system upon system upon system. And for years, people said, well, what's your learning management system? And you'd say, well, we don't have one. It's this conglomeration. After years and years and years of this building up. We do have an SIS system banner, but of course we had banner configured for our needs, which in a more traditional setting, the banner system or whatever the SIS system is going to be configured for the more traditional needs. And to change that, as we all know, it's way beyond just a few shadow systems. It means really rethinking how in the world those whole huge operations are going to function. And what we have found at WGU is only recently, in the last, I'd say 3 years, we are going back and having to track every one of those fix-it systems that were designed as new issues arose. And we're also finding that there are a number of new companies coming into the scene that are designed in terms of, say, a learning management system to be able to incorporate things like students moving at their own pace, finishing or starting at different times, not term-based, and developing in different ways. And that's really, I think, where we've got to head. I don't know. I hope that helps with a response to that.
Just reiterating that a little bit, the current student information systems of most higher ed institutions in the United States, the big players, they're very term-based and not very flexible in this regard. Ironically, the UK again, the big player in the UK is a company called Tribal. That's about 70% of the UK market, and they actually have learning outcomes tied to workforce placement because of the Bologna compliance and being part of Erasmus Without Borders. We have a really good opportunity, though, because there's at least 3 major SIS providers that are going to be moving into sort of a cloud-based, moving from a fixed code structure to one that you actually configure on top of it. Workday's putting pressure on everybody. Oracle's announced that they're going to be developing a more advanced system, Lucian as well. This is a really good opportunity to remind them as they're developing these to take advantage of some of these changes to make it asynchronous, self-paced, non-term-based processes part of their product.
Mike, can I just ask a question to follow up on that? As those new tools are coming online across your so from admissions to the academics, the administrative side of the house, to the academic, the financial, are like the leaders across the institution, are they like together cognizant of the kind of change that means? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look at the Kentucky Community College system. They're having really good conversations with the SIS providers about an entire state system moving to a competency-based approach and putting a lot of pressure on those systems. I mean, this is a big business. I mean, we've not seen major SIS providers. We have not seen campuses give up on their current SIS providers very often. But I think in this new realm, there's going to be pressure on them and lots of new opportunities out there. When it's not so difficult to do an implementation, when you're just configuring on top of some fixed code, that's going to be a lot different dynamic. So I think those conversations are taking place quite a bit within the institutions.
Charlotte, do you want to?
I was going to say the Competency-Based Education Network, which has about 30 member institutions, has also been meeting with vendor groups to try to help advance this and to really flesh out of those 30 member institutions, what are the real challenges. I see a number of companies here in the room today that we've worked with. It's really important that we keep that conversation going, like KCTCS and others. It takes all of us saying, man, we really need a solution. We really need some help here.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go to Cliff and then over here to this side. Cliff, I'd like to ask you a question, if you could reflect on it. Okay. So as you hear,
ask them, but that's
so we've heard DQP mentioned a few times by the panel, the degree qualifications profile for folks that don't know it. I'm wondering, when you think of Cliff was one of the authors of the degree qualifications profile for folks that don't know. When you hear the current competency-based education conversation, along with the credit for prior learning conversation, both different ways of validating learning is a term that I use, but with the DQP in place, does that make it easier to normalize these alternative ways of looking at learning and assessing it? but while leaving independence for institutions. I'm just curious if you could reflect on that.
That your question intersects the question I was going to deal with them too, which is about record keeping, diploma supplements, and who's driving this car anyway. Yes, the DQP, which in its most recent iteration is focused on proficiencies, not competencies. The difference between competencies, which we regard as formative, and proficiencies as summative, and that's a very different approach to these things. That's number one. Number two, and it goes along with something Natasha was saying about assessment. Assessment is institutional. Assignments, which the DQP emphasizes, are faculty driven. And so you have a completely different orientation that way. That in turn makes it both more challenging and more difficult to deal with record keeping. When we first presented the DQP, the audience we used was the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, which said, not surprisingly, wait a minute, guys, what about record keeping in this age of post-credit, phenomena? How do you deal with that? And our challenge was, how do you avoid it looking like a checklist? As opposed to something else. You will see in the latest version of the DQP in Appendix F, which is called Issues and Concerns, one of the principal issues was precisely that. And we said, okay, everybody, this ought to give you pause. And you got to do some serious work on this, because a checklist is not what you want. On the other hand, what you started, Mike, describing when UC San Diego, and a very creative school anyway to begin with, got me the diploma supplements, which you referenced. I'm not sure how many people in this room know what a diploma supplement is. It's part of the Bologna process, the European documentation of what students learn. What's wrong with, I'm going to pick on you, Natasha, saying, here's Natasha graduating from Old Siwash with a degree in psychoceramics, a degree Lou and I know a good deal about. That's crackpots for those of you who haven't caught up with us. Natasha's got there. What's wrong with a one-pager which fits what I call the Twitter minds we refer to as employers, because they have 140 character span of attention. That's one pager that's got the 6 competences that the psychoceramics department chose as proficiencies, as Natasha demonstrated, and this illustrates what she's learned in our department. 6 other generic competences that Old Siwash chooses that show what she learned. This is all on one page. Natasha's 3-sentence description of her senior project, I don't know, something in ethology about watching animals in a park, I don't know, something like that, which is signed off approved by the academic dean. 3 sentences of her community service project where she created a park for squirrels. I don't know. Wonderful. Which is signed off by the student service, dean as a diploma supplement. What's wrong with that? How can registrars deal with it? Yes, they can. It should be pretty easy. I'm trying to get around this. How do you get something that's standardized, that people can read and recognize without being monotoned? In other words, with giving Natasha her colors, her palette, giving you, Lou, your colors and your palette, and Sally, even you. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please, Natasha, please, before he goes on.
And what's kind of ironic is one of the conversations we had in the UK recently with them. They wanted to interview us about the possibility of the UK going to grades, because their classification system wasn't providing sufficient differentiation among students. And I thought, well, that's a different conversation than we're having in the US, because we're coming to you to talk about how you're gathering outcomes and co-curricular experiences. So I think it's infinitely doable. I just think right now we have to explore leave the bucket somewhat separate for a while the exploration takes place. I've seen some really good, I like the document that Northern Arizona puts out. It gets to the issue of providing some differentiation among students, because you can go kind of above and beyond being competent. It allows for incomplete so that you could move in and out. But I mean, I think this is kind of an exciting time for members of our profession, working with faculty to get creative and come up with something that we can look back on and say, we've really done a fundamental change in how we represent the learning that students did at our campuses.
I just want to pick up on one sort of thread that I see that Cliff also mentioned running through all of these different initiatives, and that is the focus on assignments. So one of the things that we asked in our last survey was to provosts at an institution level, tell us the most useful piece of information you have about your students' learning at an institution level. What's the most helpful thing? They're using national surveys, they have rubrics, employer surveys. What is it? And they said classroom-based assessments, assignments. The most useful source of information about a student's learning is the assignments that we ask them to do in a course that's related to their learning, that asks them to apply and transfer their knowledge, which is exactly what we ask them to do in credit for prior learning. Prior learning, show us what you can do. Complete this assignment. In competency-based education, when you're looking at, are you mastering this competency? You need to complete a task, a situation. You need to engage in an assignment. In each of these things, and thinking about where we are in the field of assessment as well, that focus on how can we craft an assignment that really elicits students' response on the outcomes that we have in question. That's like the $1 million question. We get that down, all of these things come together. We have a way to think about that in a transcript approach. We have a way for students to talk about that. We have a way that makes this part of the work that we're doing with every student every day. And so for me, where I sit in assessment, I see this as a wonderful leverage point of awareness in the field, that on the ground, that course-based assessment can be much more meaningful to students in their movements, for institutions, for the programs, than the other kind of systems of assessment we've applied. And having some kind of agreement and consensus on what does it mean to have a well-designed, well-crafted assignment that actually elicits students. That can be, I think, where really this rubber hits the road.
And just one observation about that, and then I want to get one more question from the audience. I was recently talking to folks from Drexel and from Northeastern about the way that their graduates interview. And they both have extensive co-op programs, Northeastern. And one of the things that they seem to score quite highly on over any number of years is that their graduates are much more cognizant of what they know. And so when they're communicating them to employers, it's surprising to realize that there will be undergraduates that actually don't know what they know, and consequently can't communicate it to others. And I think this assignment level notion is powerful there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just to follow up with one short anecdote. So I do a lot of travel, and you have that plane conversation where you're like, so what do you do? Where are you going? And I say, I work at an institute where we study how do you know if students learn anything in college. That's like my short little airplane speech. And without fail, the person sitting next to me is like, I didn't learn a thing in college. I wouldn't say that, at least lie to me about something. But mostly then when they start telling me about what they got out of their college experience, they think about their learning in terms of content. I don't remember the date in this history course that this thing happened. I don't remember the first instance of a genome structure and whatever. But what they do remember, and they tell me that was meaningful, was their teamwork skills. They understand how to think critically. They understand how to ask meaningful questions. They have all these wonderful things that we care about as the outcomes, but they're sitting there completely unaware that that's what we were going for. One of the things that I think is beautiful about competency-based education and prior learning is it's incredibly transparent. You're telling people up front, this is what we care about, and let's all stand behind this and be in this together. And so that level of transparency, that level of awareness, that level for students to be able to say to an employer, this is what I can know and do with confidence, and not have, I would love to get to a place where I fly and I turn to someone and they're like, I can list off my 9 competencies. And that would be like, I just go home and be done. Like, that would just be great. But I think that is a huge, a win for everyone involved. And it's a wonderful win for education where we sit in policy right now, where we don't have a good response to how are we assuring quality in a way that people believe. If our students can talk on that point for us, I mean, that's a wonderful thing. So,
in the interest of staying on time, I want to kind of move to our close now and just say that, when I had read the papers and reflected on how I wanted the panel to go, I couldn't have asked for the panel to go any better. It's this really interesting mix of practice, things happening, and how, in fact, there's innovation happening that you're not even aware of. And it's hard. And there's, in the practice, in the small aspects of some of the things that, Chris and Mary Beth picked up in their paper, of small institutional changes, you see some of the beginnings of the answers to some of the questions that Deb and Deb, which is now you will forever be known as Deb and Deb. I'm sorry. Some of the bigger consequential questions at a system level or society level even. And I think that our panelists unpack that really well here. But a lot of it was just, as I was listening to the responses, I intuit the energy that's happening on campuses from the energy I heard from the panel. You were all very energetic if you didn't notice that. And so join me in thanking the panel first. I also want to thank the authors of both papers for giving us a rich set of ideas to discuss and think about. I want to thank Deb Seymour from my colleague from the Center for Attainment and Innovation for partnering with the Center for Policy Research and Strategy on this topic. Both of our teams for just being there for support. Daria Razavi, our assistant, and also Christine Ritter in particular, Deb's assistant, who did a remarkable job with the logistics for this event. And Jeff Davies, who is ACE's Chief Financial Officer, for joining us today. He's a great supporter of all of our work. Thank you all for coming. I hope you found it enriching and look for more of these types of events. Thank you.